The following content is provided under a Creative Commons license. Your support will help MIT OpenCourseware continue to offer high-quality educational resources for free. To make a donation or view additional materials from hundreds of MIT courses, visit MIT OpenCourseware at ocw.mit.edu.
So, as you might have noticed, much of this class and much of our work, in a sense, is about designing good policies given the particular challenge and environment the policy is functioning in. So, that's a lot of what we do. If you look at a lot of how policy is made in the world, it has less to do with the problem than to do with other priorities. So, the example we give in the book and is emphasized here is Egypt. Egypt became a major recipient of US aid in 1979 when Egypt essentially broke ranks with the Arab countries and signed the Camp David Accord with Israel. And the Camp David Accord was not quite a declaration of friendship, but it was enough of a change in the relationship that Egypt was then on seen as a major ally for U.S.-Israeli interests in the Middle East. So it was a very substantial political change. As a reward, in a sense, for agreeing to that, Egypt was offered a lot of aid every year. So Egypt is the biggest recipient, other than Israel, of U.S. aid over this period, and that was not based on the idea that either that Egypt was a country that was particularly poor. Egypt is one of the richer countries in Africa, or on the idea that Egypt was going to do a lot of good with the money. There was no such presumption, no such idea was ever mooted. It was very clear that the money in Egypt was supposed to be a payoff for being friendly, a payoff not necessarily to the president, but a payoff to, maybe to some extent to the military establishment in Egypt. So a payoff nonetheless. So it was very much seen as a payoff. So that was, as a result, I mean, basically, if you take the amount, enough aid was given to Egypt every year to pay $20 per African child under 5. So just to get a magnitude of that, Egypt is one of the richest countries in Africa. The aid given to Egypt was so large that it could have been given, if it was given to the rest of Africa, it would have been $5 for every child under 5. So that's a significant amount of money. It was not given based on the idea that Egypt was going to make very good use of this money, since there was certainly it was not really development aid, it was just aid as a price for being our friends. And that's an important example because it underscores the point that even though we may work very hard and come up with policies that make sense, often money is spent for reasons which have nothing to do with sense, or may have sense, but sense in some other calculus. So if that's what you're going to do, and that's related to a separate point, which is, so one point that comes up in that process is that, what's the point of knowing anything if money is going to be not given, if money will not be given where the information is. So the information says that you should do this policy, but in fact Egypt gets all the money because it happens to be the country that's willing to be nice to Israel. So that's a one question. Related question is, some countries just don't have a functioning state. Right now, a prominent example is Côte d'Ivoire. Côte d'Ivoire, if you noticed, has an ongoing civil war where the president is supposed to have lost the election but doesn't seem to want to leave, and there's a French army in there, and which may or may not succeed in re-establishing order, etc. So at this point, who's going to do? We might discover the very efficient way to find people who get people to immunize their children, but that might be beside the point in Côte d'Ivoire, because it's true that in Côte d'Ivoire right now there is no state, and therefore if we think of a policy that's going to be adopted by the state, who's going to be the state that adopts that? So that's sort of the big. So a lot of people have made that point against us, if you like, and I think the most articulate version of that is this paragraph by Bill Easterly, who says randomized control trials are infeasible for many of the big questions of development, like the economy-wide effects of good institutions or good macroeconomic policies. Embracing randomized control trials has led development researchers to lower their ambitions. So this is basically this is not the big issues are not being touched here. What we are doing is we are solving small problems, and the implied argument is that if you don't solve the big problems, there's no reason to solve the small ones. That we should start by solving the big problems of state formation, of good macroeconomic policies, getting an effective functioning state, and then solve the other problems. So there's a lot of people who are, I think, very fine economists who believe in this position, which is what I would call the institutionalist view, and that's really two separate, possibly independent claims. One is that without good politics, you cannot have good policies, and the second is that with good politics, good policies will follow. So there are claims in two directions, right? One is a positive claim, the other is a negative claim. That is, it's hopeless to try to do anything if you have bad politics. And what people really mean by politics is not just that you should have a good leader or something, but you need a package of what people think of as appropriate institutions. So the basic vision is that there are appropriate institutions, and there are things like property rights. Like basically, is there private property or not? Is private property well secured? That's one thing people focus on. The second thing people focus on is whether the political system is relatively open, there's some constraints on the executive, or whether there is basically absolutism. So the guy who's running in power can do whatever he wants. So those are the kinds of things. So we will use I'm going to keep using institutions with capitals for a while, and you'll see why later. So I'm going to use it in capitals for the time being. So well, let me say what I'm trying to get at. These are not only institutions. MIT is an institution too, but it's not institution in the same sense as property rights is an institution, right? MIT is I'm sure MIT is a veritable, respected institution, but it would not count in the same sense as institutions in this sense. This is institutions meaning these big things that define how the economic and political system jointly functions. There are few institutional, few kind of structural features of the economy which drive everything else, and those are things like property rights, political system, etc. So I think more interesting place to start is to look at the work of Acemoglu, Johnson, and Robinson. Acemoglu and Johnson are both MIT professors. This is a really interesting book, and what I'm going to try to what they claim in their book is that countries succeed or fail based on institutions as defined by property rights, a few things like this nature of property rights, the nature of the political system, etc. And what they have done, I think, very compellingly is provide some very interesting evidence along these lines. So I'm going to start by presenting the evidence, and then we'll think about given that evidence, how should we think about the world. Now, the first reason why this evidence is difficult is because institutions are endogenous. What do I mean by when I say institutions are endogenous?
In the beginnings of the day, we're persistent. So if you started off, or for some reason, an institution went into a place that was very extractive or had like a very hierarchical structure, it would tend to stay in place over time.
So you're saying it's the opposite. You're saying institutions are not affected by local conditions.
Well, they're initially formed by something.
Sorry?
They are initially formed by something, but once they're in place.
But they're formed by something. That's the key.
And I guess if we can't do a management institutions that was created by that society, so it's not really directly, not necessarily to.
So you want to add to that?
Yeah, I wanted to say that the state of the society determines which institutions it has, but at the same time, the institutions contribute to the state of the society.
Right. So you might say that, for example, to have effective property rights, we need effective courts. To have effective courts, we need effective judges. To have effective judges, we need an effective education system. To have an effective education system, we might need good property rights. So it might all of these things are related, and we may, if people the investment in the education system may not be effective without property rights. So all of these things are related. So basically, institutions are endogenous in the sense that lots of things that matter for other aspects of the economy also affect institutions. Institutions are a result of what else is happening in the economy. They're also a cause. So that's what makes it difficult. So how do you study the effects? Problem with things which are endogenous is that how do you study the effects of those? Because in some sense, the basic rule about studying the effect of something is what we want to do is we want to say, here's two countries, one country has better institutions than the other entirely by chance, not because this country has some other aspect that makes it better, right? The problem is we are worried that, if I say that Spain has better institutions than Portugal, then I would need to argue that this is not a result of the fact that Spain was to start with a stronger economy, and that's why the institutions came out. We want to say there are two countries which are essentially identical, and by an act of chance, Portugal got worse institutions than Spain. And those acts of chance are difficult to find. That's basically the challenge. So how does anybody solve this problem? Well, here's a very nice insight. The very nice insight is that in former colonies, so take the countries that were European colonies. There's a lot of countries, pretty much all of Africa and most of Asia and most of Latin America, all of Latin America, most of Asia and most of Africa were former colonies of either Britain, France, Holland, Portugal, Spain, or Belgium. I think essentially these 6 countries were, between them, and Germany to a very small extent, had most of the world carved up. So most countries were colonies of these countries. And it turns out, not surprisingly, it's what was said a little while ago, institutions are persistent. So if good institutions were set up in this country a long time ago, they still remain relatively good. And if bad institutions were set up, so good and bad here are, I'm not telling you what good and bad are yet, I'll tell you what they mean in a minute, but the basic theory is that whatever institutions were set up a long time ago, that's how they stay. So institutions are persistent, that's step 1. Step 2 is to observe that when Europeans settled in a country, they were very clear about what kinds of institutions they want to set up. And that has a lot to do with whether they want to live in the country or not. If they didn't want to live in the country, so they just wanted to go there, control the country, and make some money from it, then these institutions they set up enabled making money quickly in the country. So they were not very protective of the local population. They were what are called extractive institutions, institutions which basically take the shape of, it's easy to kind of bully people, not a lot of legal protection, so that you could extract whatever you wanted. You want the mines to be very profitable. You don't really want legal rights for the workers, because if you had legal rights for the workers, then they would complain, and then you wouldn't get very profitable mines. So if you want mines to be profitable, the best way to do it is to not have many legal rights for workers. If you want labor to be cheap, you don't want to educate the labor force. If you want people to be docile, you don't want to have a lot of democracy. So basically, on the other hand, if you Europeans were going to stay there, then their vision for the country was very different. They wanted it to be livable and kind of like their lives in Europe, and then they set up institutions which were much less directly extractive. And that happens to be true, sadly enough. So what are countries where Europeans did settle, and what are countries where they didn't settle? Examples.
Well, the United States, Australia, Canada, Argentina, New Zealand.
So those are good examples. What are countries where they didn't settle? And you can start to see what the pattern is going to be. What are countries where they didn't settle? Yeah. Sorry?
Oh, sorry. Well, during, well, even after I guess they still didn't settle really in Africa.
Where in Africa did they settle? South Africa, to some extent Zimbabwe, to some extent Kenya. Those were 3 countries where they settled, and most other countries they didn't settle. So that's an example of and you can see that now one reason. So here's what's nice about their paper. They claim that one reason this happened was because of settler mortality. So if you look at if you look at these early colonies in the first years of settlement, there are massive mortality rates, really massive. Like 4 out of 5 people died within 5 years. I mean, that kind of mortality rates, because Europeans were encountering new diseases, basically new tropical diseases of all kinds. So the mortality rates were massive. And so therefore, the places where they agreed to settle were places where where the mortality rates were relatively low. And so one good predictor of what happens, whether you get one good predictor of whether you get European settlement or not is settler mortality in the early days. And so what they did, which is very creative, is to find a data set of settler mortality in these places. And so basically the idea is, let's look at what happens. Let's compare places where the settlers died in droves with places where they didn't. So here's a set of pictures that underpin their paper. So let's start with the first one. This is really this is the picture of GDP per capita on expropriation risk. Expropriation risk is how secure our property. So expropriation is the opposite of property rights. So expropriation risk is just how likely is it that if you have a private property, it will just be taken away by the state. Okay, so that's, and you see that countries where it varies a lot. It's high in Haiti, in Mali, in Nigeria. It's low in the US, Singapore, Australia, and New Zealand. So if you look at the colonies that do well, they tend to be relatively, the richer colonies are also the ones which had lower expropriation risk. So now this is the endogenous regression, because you could have almost run this regression the other way around. You could have asked, is it the case that rich countries have lower expropriation risk? This is not a regression that can be causally interpreted by itself, because it's exactly saying that expropriation risk is high in rich countries. But is that because rich countries are safer, or is it because safe countries are richer? We don't know. Okay, so this picture's. Now, before I come to actually, let me skip these two pictures. Come back to them later. Here's a more maybe revealing picture. So this picture says, what's the relationship between settler mortality and GDP per capita? And this is kind of a dramatic fact, which is that if settler mortality was high, like in the Gambia, GMB, Nigeria, Mali, Togo, those countries are poor. The countries which are rich tended to have had low settler mortality. Okay, so if we think that settler mortality has nothing to do with GDP today, then that's a surprising fact. Why was it that settlers, when they came to settle, when did they come to settle in the Americas? When were the Americas settled? 16th and 17th century. When was Africa settled? 19th century. So these are all a long time. When was Asia settled? When was Asia conquered? 18th and 19th mostly. So these are all, everything that we're talking about is saying that what happened before 1850 or 1880 basically has a strong consequence of what's on outcomes today. So if you were a country where Europeans died in droves in 1870, like Gambia or I don't know, whenever there was 1860, people died in droves in 1860, then Gambia is still a poorer country. So that's sort of an interesting correlation. And here's why they think that this. Now, they are then asked the question, now that I told you that Gambia is poorer than the US, and it used to, and even 120 years ago I could have predicted this, you say why? Why would that be the case? How could you, what's the link between 120 years and now? And their claim is that this is the persistence of institutions. So Gambia is a place where the Europeans didn't settle. As a result, they set up extractive institutions, and extractive institutions are very persistent. So the reason why we see this mapping from settler mortality to expropriation risk to GDP is the reason why we have the persistence. Settler mortality affected institutions when the country was set up, which affected institutions now. And it's very dramatic again. The quality of the institutions goes down very fast with settler mortality. So that's the basic argument. The basic argument in the paper is these two facts, which is that, look, countries which had high settler mortality are poorer, and they have poorer institutions. And there's no reason why something that happened so long ago would affect outcomes today, and therefore it must be institutions. Now, they do something else that's actually very interesting. In fact, they do more than this. What I told you is they actually, one thing they do is to argue that in the world of, like, let's say 1500 or 1600, we don't know GDP in 1600. So what they're going to try to argue is not just that we see this pattern, but this pattern doesn't reflect fixed geographical characteristics of these countries, because if there were fixed geographical characteristics of these countries, then the countries where you had low settler mortality would have been countries which were richer already in 1500. So it's not the case that. So one thing they want to show is that this is not the effect of some long-term historical difference. It is not that the countries that have low settler mortality were rich countries already. So the US, which had low settler mortality, was actually a poor country in 1500. How do they show that? Well, they can't actually measure GDP in 1500 very well. But one thing they can do is they can use urbanization rates or population density. Historically, richer countries had more population. So let's start with this. No. Start with this picture. This picture says that if you look at urbanization and GDP per capita, these are extremely correlated. Right? Extremely tightly related. So then they're making the point that therefore urbanization rates today in 1500 are a reasonable proxy for GDP in 1500. Okay, that's the second step in the argument. Okay, and you don't. So this picture says urbanization rates in 1500. If you assume that that's a predictor of GDP in 1500, then look at that relationship. What does that say? What do? Yeah.
So the richer country was in 1500, the poorer it is now.
Yeah. The richer the country was in 1500, the poorer it is now.
So Sorry, I'm not sure I'm understanding it. Wouldn't initial population density play a huge role? So maybe the tropical areas had a higher population density than the temperate zones that were colonized later, and that settlers set up their own settlements. I think one of the authors talked a bit about how not having a population there in the first place was one of the reasons that they settled there as well. And then also, if you're looking at urbanization rates, shouldn't you compare the tropical colonies before they were urbanized to European countries that did the colonization, and you see higher urbanization rates in the temperate zones that had comparable population densities?
Okay, those are both good points. Hold them. We'll come back to them. Okay, you're asking questions about whether this argument is. You're trying to pick holes in this argument. Let's wait on that. I want to understand the argument before picking holes in it. So, I think both points you made are interesting. We'll hold them. We'll repeat them in a minute. Okay. So right now they're making the case. Look, it's not that there is a persistence of poverty. It is not the case that the countries that were poor in 1500 are poor now. If urbanization is a good measure of poverty, then of being wealthy, then those countries were rich countries then and are poor countries now. And the US, for example, was a poor country then and a rich country now. Indeed, famously, there's a claim that the reason why the British didn't manage to take back the US in 1776, because the US was very weak relative to Britain in 1776. How did the US colonies manage? Well, there was a threat of another attack to Jamaica, which was a much wealthier area, sugar growing, much wealthier area. So that's why the British government had to decide whether to protect Jamaica or to protect the US. And it decided Jamaica was more worth protecting than the US. May have not been the right judgment historically, but nonetheless. So they made this call on it based apparently on the fact that Jamaica was a wealthier area. This is another one. This is on log population density, which is another classical measure of wealth. So typically, historically, more populated countries are rich, have been richer countries. Indeed, historically, a lot of people said that basically there was people often suggested a very simple model, which is sometimes called the Malthusian model, which is that if countries are more productive, they can sustain a bigger population, because if you're not more productive, then if you had a bigger population, they'll starve to death. So basically, the Malthusian model says that more productive countries had bigger populations, and you see that if you believe that, then once again, richer countries in 1500 are poorer countries now. Finally, population density in 1500 is, you can see, is a negative predictor of expropriation risk now. So more dense countries in 1500 have worse protection against expropriation. So they have worse property rights. And you basically, what this is saying is that you look at the economic outcomes of the high urbanization countries and the low urbanization countries in 1500, you can see that the high urbanization countries actually fall below the low urbanization countries in the middle of the 18th century, in the middle of the 19th century. And this is GDP. So they call this the reversal of fortune. So two claims being made. One is that rich countries became poorer, and the reason why they became poorer is because of the pattern of settlement, which generated better institutions, which generated better economic outcomes. Okay. then they go on to claim that if Zaire had the same institutions as the US today, it would be 5 times richer. So that's a huge claim, right? It's huge. The magnitudes they're talking about are immense. So you were beginning to, so now coming back to the question, you were starting to ask questions about this evidence. What are possible ways in which this evidence might be misleading? So let's go back to you.
One was that I thought maybe they should compare tropical, if they're dismissing the geography explanation, they should compare tropical countries before they were colonized to European countries before they actually colonized the other countries, because it might be that North America and New Zealand and Australia that had better institutions didn't really have population settled there in the first place, which was probably part of the reasons that European colonizers set up camp there.
So you're saying empty places may be different. If places were empty, the development patterns may be different for a variety of reasons, which may not have to do with institutions. It may well be that if you start with an empty place, you can have a different development pattern, even if you have the same institutions. That's one of the. Is that what you're saying?
Kind of, but also that if you compare, if you're trying to totally dismiss the fact that climate may have played a role, you should compare places with similar population densities to start off with. So you should compare Europe to.
I don't know. Why would I? Why would that make sense? That I didn't understand.
Because in comparing sort of Latin America and Sub-Saharan Africa, one of the papers talked about how there already were sort of rich cultures thriving there, and that there was a reversal of fortune. But if you're comparing those places to, say, North America and New Zealand, the population in North America and New Zealand were really small. There wasn't a lot going on, so maybe you should compare it to Europe. I think Europe would have been a lot more prosperous if you compare it to the Inca, Aztec.
I see. You're saying that that maybe comparing with the places where the empty places is misleading, because those places are, but it still isn't the point that it's misleading, because empty places could have, for some reason, would have a different development path. After all, the empty places cross the bed, become better. So you're saying that even without good institutions, empty places might have had a different path, because maybe it is the case that the population, just the population composition is different. If I settle, if there's no one else living there and I go and settle, I'm 100% of the population. And whereas if a lot of people living there, then if I go settle, I'm a different fraction of the population. Okay, you were first.
Do you think that the countries that actually colonize, the ones who actually go and settle, do you think depending on what country does that makes a difference on how well the colony does? Like, for example, all the colonies that ended up doing well were, British colonies. And of course, you have India, which,
there's a lot of British colonies that don't do well. Nigeria, Ghana, Uganda,
right.
Sierra Leone, there are lots of British colonies.
Right.
Burma.
But also the other ones were, those happen at different times, right? Many of the, a lot of the imperialist stuff happened later on, and a lot of the exploration happened in Africa. Of course, there was already trafficking in terms of slavery and things like that, beginning in the 1600s or so. But a lot of the colonies that happened in Africa were, in a different time, you know, in the history spectrum. So I just think that, you know, the environment was just different, you know, like the world was very different at the time.
Yeah, but I don't see why that's the point. Explain. I mean, I think I agree with everything you said. Oops. You want to add to that? I don't understand exactly why that's a criticism what they're doing. I understood if you said.
I was just asking a question actually, because that's just something that comes up. I mean, when I. You know, like,
that's absolutely true. I think everything you said is true, but I don't see why. So they were definitely colonized at different times, but still, two things they do. One is they compare within Africa. They can compare within Africa. It's not quite statistically as solid as it should be, but you can still do it. You can compare Zimbabwe, South Africa, Kenya with the rest of Africa, the countries which have high settlement and low settlement, and you see some of the same difference. Mostly driven by South Africa, unfortunately, which is rather special. But you can do it. The second thing you can do is you can control for the identity of the colonizer, and that doesn't change anything. So you can compare only British colonies with British colonies, and that doesn't change anything. That's much more solid. So you could compare just French colonies with French colonies, British colonies with British colonies, and average.
So even within Africa.
I don't know whether you can do that, or that becomes too small a data set. So if you compare only Spanish colonies within Africa, there will be two, and that may not be.
Yeah,
that's not going to be a lot of.
Within Africa, would you say that British colonies are probably better off than, let's say, Portuguese colonies, right? You have Angola and Mozambique.
It's probably true, actually.
Whereas you compare that to South Africa, South Africa is much better off.
It's probably true, but I don't. That's not what they do. I mean, they're worried about that. Comparison is difficult because British colonies are not randomly chosen. Britain was one of the leaders in African colonization. Britain was one of the leaders. Britain got all the most productive countries. So if you look at, sorry? France was a follower, and so France ended up with the less productive countries. So Britain targeted some countries, and he grabbed the best ones. So this is not an accident. Yeah.
So to follow up on the earlier point of emptier places versus more heavily populated places before the Europeans came.
Yeah.
If a place was more populated, then it would probably already have some kind of institutions. And if some institutions already exist, whether they be equitable or not equitable, I think it would be much easier to establish institutions which would not be equitable. Because the system is already set up.
That's a good point, but that they won't disagree with, obviously. They're just saying, imagine that they said that, places which had no one there or very low population density in the beginning, it was easier to set up fresh institutions, and fresh institutions persist. Would you say that that's not a version of the institutionalist argument? That's just a slight variant on their argument. I don't think it's that different.
Well, I would think that if it's an empty place, then the probability that you can set up an growth-creating institution would be lower.
That's absolutely true. I think they would say that that's still an argument for why expropriating institutions are bad. You are just making a slightly different argument for why expropriating institutions are bad. Yeah.
Yeah, just getting back to the point, I know it's kind of annoying, but so when you say, yeah, that's correct, that, the British Empire was sort of the leader when colonizing Africa. However, that's not the case when you're talking about the Americans, right? And right, so even though Spain and Portugal were the leaders in this case, it's not like they did invite colonization. And when you even reference the paper, if British Empire chose the richer countries in Africa to colonize, wouldn't that imply that they would have a position that's more exploration based, and therefore maybe South Africa would be in a worse position? Or so does that make sense? Or does it really show
it's not so clear. They might have chosen. We're getting off point, but let's say just to comment. The British might have picked better places. Now, better places may be more productive. They might also be more attractive to be expropriating. But those two factors are going opposite directions. So you might, if you started with better places, that already helps you a lot. And maybe then you exploit a bit more. You set up slavery or something. But still, it might well be on balance that you do less damage there. It's not clear. Because you start with a better place, then you do a little more damage. I don't know which way it goes. But you're right. I mean, that's certainly a good point. Any other concerns?
Sorry to bring this back, but I still don't really get how you can completely disregard the climate and the geographical argument, because it's clear that the United States remains a more viable colony than
Well, to be honest, I think if you look at the world in 1800, the United States doesn't look like a more valuable economy. It looks like a less valuable economy, because the idea was that places that could grow sugar were the most valuable places. So when they compare places within the Americas, they typically compare Jamaica with the US. And Jamaica was the place which looked more valuable then. US was actually a good place to settle, because no one was empty and no one wanted to come there. So it was empty and not much competition. The British were very worried that the Spanish would take Jamaica. Yeah, keep going.
if you compare like the whole America, like both South America and North America to, for example, the African continent, I mean, it is, or Asia to Africa, it is quite clear that Africa is definitely favorable, that is the least favorable in terms of land. And I think it's a very important factor as well. The institutions point.
But that's the point about the reversal of fortune. In a sense, the reversal of fortune is exactly the point that these were richer places. In 1500, the places which are poor now were rich places. So somehow you need to argue that geography has a different effect then than it has now. It's not implausible. So you might be one point that I think one point you could make is that geography is not some fixed thing. These countries were poorer, richer then, because this was a period when it turned out that agriculture mattered, and then they invested a lot in agriculture. Turned out that by some accident, industry became the big thing later, and so places that started later were more able to jump onto the industry bandwagon than the places that. So geography might be a geography that helped you originally might hurt you later, because you are, Jamaica specialized in sugar. Sugar was great in 1800, but not so great now, because something better got discovered. So maybe what happened was that these places that it was not the institutions, it was just the specialization in certain products that really mattered. You want to continue?
To what extent can you then say that, for example, the African countries that were more for resources, such as like you're just going to take
but why? But in some sense, why is it that? I mean, fine, but isn't that just a version of the institutional argument that where you want to extract diamonds, you don't create any institutions, you just extract, And that's exactly their point, in a sense, is that you create extractive institutions. That doesn't seem any different from, just seems like a variant on the argument that, you know, where you set up extractive institutions, you get bad outcomes. Yeah.
I really like your point. I don't want to build upon. So could it be the case? So what you're saying is like a shift in comparative advantage because they had invested a lot in agriculture. That was the thing back then. They were well off, but as the times changed, that became less of an emphasis. The other countries were investing in other things better. It could also be the case that the other countries, the ones in temperate environments, were forced to look at other things earlier on because they knew that agriculture wasn't their comparative advantage. And that was a bet that they made, not knowing how the future would be, but it was a bet that paid off.
Excellent. That's an excellent point. So it could be that just, you know, if you have very easy access to very productive agriculture, then you create a society which is not looking forward to solving certain types of problems. So that's an excellent point. I don't know if it's true or not, but it's an extremely interesting observation. I hadn't thought of that. And more generally, I mean, one concern with this kind of evidence is that, you know, as you might imagine, there are not that many, I mean, the most compelling examples turn out to be Hong Kong, Singapore, South Africa, and plus US, Canada, New Zealand, Australia, you know, really very few, the regressions driven by very few countries, though I think if you look at this picture, it's less true than you might imagine. So look at this, it's actually, no, yeah, we can do this one. So if you look at this picture, it's not entirely driven by, so if you look at that square in the middle, even there's a slight downward slope. So leave out US, New Zealand, Canada, Singapore, Hong Kong, Malaysia. Those are on the left. And just South Africa and whatever, one other country. I can't remember what it is. And look at the block in the middle where India is the top left-hand point and whatever MLI is Mali is the bottom left point, bottom right point. Even within the square, there's clear downward slope, I think. So it's not, you can leave out, even if you left out the very rich countries, you do get a weaker but significant relationship. And that still tells you, if you just took that relationship, you still will get a big effect of settler mortality, even if you left out the very, you know, the few really exceptionally rich countries or something. You will still get reasonably good, good fit. I guess one concern I have is whether or not expropriation risk is something that we assign to countries based on success. So one worry I have is that it may well be that the countries that had high settler mortality are poor for whatever reason, and then we think it's because of expropriation risk, but expropriation risk is just based on you know, our perception of economic success. So India and Pakistan are assigned very different expropriation risk. One is at 8 and the other is at 6. I'm not sure that those are based on anything particular. I think there might well be a legitimation of success. So countries which are successful are assigned better. In these numbers, who knows what expropriation risk is? It's some number somebody made up. And we may worry that this number isn't quite right, and maybe all it does is just reflects the fact that richer countries are richer. So you know, people assign them higher. You know, these countries are richer; they must have good property rights. I don't know how much of that's what's going on. So that, but I still think that in some sense, I guess I'm more inclined to to take this evidence as telling us something interesting. But I think one should take it really seriously. So first point it's making, if you take it seriously, is not that the institutions are important. It's not saying just that institutions are important. It's saying something much more specific than that. It's saying institutions that were set up a long time ago and evolved slowly over time in countries where there was low settler mortality are very different from institutions that were set up a long time ago and evolved for a long time in high settler mortality countries. So it's not saying that if I suddenly took Mali and gave it the institutions of the US, the institutions will automatically start functioning. That's not in this data. It's not saying anything about whether or not we can replace institutions in one place by the other, right? It's in fact saying quite the opposite. It's saying that, all we can tell is that places that got good institutions because of a lucky accident 200 years ago or 400 years ago are better off now. That's not necessarily a big policy helpful policy. It's not that it says that we could change institutions today successfully. That's not what it implies. I mean, it could be true that we can change it, but this is not what we learn from this evidence. What we learn from this evidence is if we happen to have been lucky 400 years ago, then we are lucky today. But that's a very different point from saying that we are able to fix institutions today, and if we gave Mali the same institutions that the US had. And that's I'm not just making a debating point. Think about what the US Constitution means. The US Constitution means a lot of things, but it also means the culture. Every person who goes to school in the US learns about the Constitution. It creates a certain set of loyalties to the Constitution which are very important. It is emphasized that this Constitution has a long history. There are lots of battles about the Constitution in the Supreme Court and other courts. All of these things are part of the effectiveness of the Constitution. It's not just the Constitution that is effective. The US Constitution is given content by all the judgments of the Supreme Court. The famous judgments of the Supreme Court is what makes the Constitution what it is today. So it's not clear that you can just transplant a Constitution without the history that goes with it. So that says that if you believe this point of view, you should be very pessimistic, because it's not actually saying that we just have to fix good institutions. This is where I think Easterly is wrong. The development policy is, even if you believe this point of view, it doesn't say much about development policy, because it actually doesn't tell you that you can fix institutions today in Mali and you'll get good outcomes. So, and Acemoglu and Robinson are very consistent in their book. They basically explicitly state this pessimistic position. They say, God knows how to fix countries, let's not even bother. Mostly that's their position, and that's a very internally consistent position. Now there are other people who take a less consistent position, who want to say that institutions are important. This is the evidence from Acemoglu and Robinson, and now we're going to go fix countries, which is a very different claim, that we're going to fix institutions. This evidence doesn't say that you can fix institutions. It says if you had the right institutions 400 years ago, then it would be good. That's very different from saying we can fix institutions. Do you see that? Yeah.
I don't know how appropriate it would be since history, time changes, what's going on in the world, but can't you kind of take this as if we could transition towards better institutions in some countries today, then maybe 400 years those countries would be better?
Maybe, but not tomorrow. Not tomorrow. So I have nothing useful to say about 400 years from now, but we can't. But it doesn't say, what it clearly doesn't say is if I fix the institutions, things will be better today. That's what it does not say, yeah.
Is there also a little bit of the corner in Africa? It's not really like nations on the south, it's not really nations. And especially just like randomly decide these little tribal communities that can't really have institutions and such.
Right. So that's also true that, I think the point you're making is also important, which is that, and we don't know how to build institutions. It's not that we can go and, it's not that, in other words, people don't live in a void. Even if you go to a country which doesn't have, so here's a fact that I always admire. Go to almost any country, take a taxi, and there are exceptions, but take a taxi. I've done it in many countries. Get off from the taxi. There's a, you either agreed on an amount when you got on the taxi, or there's a meter. You read the meter, you give the person the amount. And at that point, the person, takes the money, he shuts the meter off, and he says, here's your change. This happens in many, many countries. Now, what's remarkable about that? What's remarkable is that, well, why did I pay this? I could have said, look, so what if it says 20? I'm going to give you 5. And what's to stop me? There's nobody else who's there. I mean, usually I get off in front of a house, there's no one else there. I can walk off. By the time the taxi driver can find the policeman, I'll be gone. Okay? On one side. So the response has to be that I'm afraid of the taxi driver beating me up, which may be true. But if the taxi driver can beat me up, why isn't the reverse true? Why isn't the taxi driver, as soon as the taxi stops, why doesn't he threaten to beat me up and say that you have to give me 40 instead of 20, or I'll beat you up, and claim that you didn't pay you owed me 40? How is it that we manage to negotiate this space in many, many countries successfully? If I'm paying the taxi driver because the taxi driver can beat me up, then he should beat me up in any case. And if he's paying me because, if I'm paying him, and otherwise if he can't beat me up, then I shouldn't pay him in any case. So why do I pay him? And why does these transactions, thousands or millions of these transactions always happen? So it must be that even societies that don't have good property right institutions enforced from up top have figured out ways to enforce lots of contracts on the ground. That has to be true. That a lot of what we call property rights must live in other forms than the form that we think of as the official form. Yeah, you had a comment?
I think it's sort of like assuming rule of law type thing, that like even if there's no like policeman standing there, you sort of assume that like, okay, we like there's a certain trust that you have.
Absolutely. So trust or something like that is important. The only point I'm making here, that's not a property right. That's something else that is important. So there are lots of substitutes, yeah?
If we think of this in terms of game theory, then if we play this game just one time, of course we can't say that, either way it can happen. But if you think of it as playing the game over and over, then you could sustain.
Well, I don't want to play with the same taxi driver. So
yeah, but I mean,
next time I'm going to cheat the next taxi driver.
If it's optimal for every taxi driver to beat you up that one time, then all the taxi drivers are going to start beating people up.
Yeah, exactly.
People will stop driving, stop using.
But that's a bad outcome. But that is the outcome predicted by the game, that there will be no taxis. In fact, taxis exist because we have trust, we have norms, we have all kinds of things which live outside this institutional frame. So one point that I think is important is to think of, if you want to transplant institutions, you have to realize that institutions already exist in these countries. Even the ones which you think don't have institutions have tons and tons of them. And you're always, trying to turn existing institutions to other institutions. You're not creating institutions de novo anywhere, ever. So we'll pick that up next time.